Welcome back to Talk the Walk with me, Sarah Wong. I'm with Michael McCarthy, Chief Strategy Officer at Tiger Brokers Australia, to delve into the crisis in Ukraine and the implication on the global economy. He joins us from Sydney. Thank you very much, Michael, for being here.
Thank you, Sarah.
I want to look at the United States. We know that the United States has banned all Russian fossil fuels imports, including oil. Now, with that being done, Washington is now eyeing new oil deals with Venezuela and Iran. How significant will that impact be on a global scale? Let's say, shall the deal go through?
Well, one of the things I think we need to note is the impact will not be as significant as it would have been 10 years ago. The US has worked hard to move towards energy independence and close the gap between what it produces on a daily basis and what it consumes. And with that gap now much closer to being closed altogether, the overall impact will probably be a reordering of trade agreements rather than a direct impact on the supply-demand equation. And so, in other words, we'll see some minor disruptions, but because it's a reordering rather than a straight-out impact on supply and demand, we're unlikely to see radical price impacts from this effect.
Now, let's look at China, because there's been reports, allegations, rumors even, saying that China will or is willing to help Moscow economically or even militarily in its invasion of Ukraine, although China definitely categorically denied those claims. But let's look at 2008, after Russia invaded Georgia. Now, at that time, Moscow had asked Beijing to mount a joint attack on the United States finances and the dollar-based global financial system. But China had held back at the time. Given what has transpired in the following decade in terms of Sino-Russia friendship amid growing Western pressure, how effective is Beijing's role in staving off the economic pain inflicted on Putin, and how much of a difference will that make?
Well, I think we have to look at the relationship between Russia and China through their eyes rather than our own. It's easy for us to sit there and misinterpret what's going on in that relationship because of our different values and our different understandings of the globe. One of the key realities here is that Russia and China share one of the largest land borders in the world. They are neighbours, and they have been for many years. And another fact that we need to consider is both Moscow and Beijing are very likely to take the long-term view of this relationship. Neither side wants unfriendly relations between these two nations, given their geographical relationship. And so I think both will take the view that while they're not happy with every aspect of the relationship between the two countries, they want to remain on good or cordial terms at the very least. And for that reason, China has a real balancing act here between maintaining cordial relations with its neighbour Russia, and at the same time maintaining its place as the fastest growing economy in the world. So that, of course, requires good relations with a lot of countries outside Russia. And so that balancing act, I think, is one of the keys for gauging how China might respond to this situation. It's very likely to keep all of those factors in mind and take a longer-term view. And for that reason, I don't think we'll see an overt declaration for or against Russia from Beijing. It's more likely to be quietly doing what it generally does, and that is doing its best to maintain good relations with Russia.
Yeah, it sounds to me it ultimately came down to political strategies, but against the backdrop of geopolitics, right? Now, in the spring of 2014, we know that's after Russia annexed Crimean Peninsula. It's the seriousness of Russia's confrontation with the West that time that prompted Moscow to pivot further to Beijing. Now, 8 years later, in China, we know that whose own economic woes amid a worsening COVID outbreak prompted political leaders to put renewed emphasis on stability and pragmatism. Will a China like that willing to help Russia weather this unprecedented sanction regime imposed by the West? But So ultimately, it boiled down to a question of political willingness. Do you see that likely to happen?
No, I don't, is the short answer. And I think you've touched on some of the key reasons why that is. In international relations, both Beijing and Moscow are very pragmatic. They seek national sovereignty in all things, as long as it's done in a peaceful, non-confrontational way. So while either side of this debate might not be thrilled with the actions of the other, as I say, the imperative to maintain a reasonable relationship here means that neither side is likely to go hard in either direction. I don't think China will withdraw cooperation from Russia. On the other hand, it's also, I believe, unlikely to come rushing to Russia's aid in this situation.
We know that China has its own woes with the United States. How will Western reactions toward Russia alter China's calculation in its own decision-making and in its own dealing with the West from now on?
Well, it's a fascinating situation and one that we're perhaps less prepared to analyse because we now really have, although the US and China are larger superpowers, Russia's resources and its military resources in particular mean that it could also be considered a superpower. So from the days of the Cold War where we were looking at two global superpowers, we're now looking at three. And how that changes the balance in world relations is a very open question that I don't think even top diplomats can answer at this stage. As I say, while there's certainly a desire to get along between Russia and China, I wouldn't suggest that there's any likelihood of a strong alliance given the cultural differences between the two nations. At the same time, they're both a mutual distrust of the US means that there are times when they're likely to ally on that question in particular. So I do think overall this represents an escalation of difficulties for the US in the global economy.
Interesting. I guess that's the real reality under a world of multipolarity that we are getting used to. Now, I want to look at the Middle East, which is definitely an important player in the oil market and oil politics in the world. And I want to look to Saudi Arabia. We know that the Saudis are a longtime U.S. ally in the Middle East, but it has not taken measures on Russia as many would have wanted, not dramatic measures like for example, like at a time after Russia's operation in the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, Saudi Arabia ended its production restraint and sent oil prices plummeting. Now, that sparked speculation at a time as of whether the Saudis are in cooperation with the U.S. to launch a joint attack against Russia. But why haven't we seen similar moves from the Saudis this time around? What's the calculation in Riyadh, do you think?
Well, part of the calculation revolves around Saudi's oil reserves. Now, the most popular contracts and the most desirable oil contracts are the sweet, light crude contracts. And that's why Brent, West Texas and Tapis dominate the global markets for oil trading. They're all examples of sweet, light crude. Now, while Saudi Arabia has the most reserves of any nation when it comes to oil, most of those reserves are heavy sour crude. So while it has the capacity to turn on the taps that it turns on are not going to replace the production that's lost in most cases. Of course, they do also have some reserves of light sweet crude, but they can't replace all of the production. Now, in markets, perception is reality. And so when there's a view that if the Saudis did turn on the taps, oil prices would fall, that's a power in the market that the Saudis want to maintain. If they demonstrate that they're turning on the taps does not result in a fall in oil prices, that would be bad news for the clout that they've enjoyed in the oil markets. But we should also bear in mind that Saudi Arabia is moving away from its almost entire dependence, its economic dependence on oil exports. It's been working for some time, particularly with the partial sale of Aramco. And so that might also have geopolitical considerations in that it might not need the US in the way that it has over the past few decades.
Very quick, are the Saudis and its Gulf partners hold enough clout, essentially, to replace Russia as a major oil producers and exporters in the world?
Well, as we saw over the last decade, Saudis have been moving closer to Russia. The OPEC Plus grouping was very important. And amongst them, the OPEC Plus grouping, which of course included Russia, produced the bulk of the world's oil. So it was a very important alliance. Now that that appears to have fractured, it reduces to some extent the clout there. But while the world is still fossil fuel dependent, the Middle Eastern nations that are significant producers will have a say. Of course, they're not one grouping. There's old rivalries and alliances within the Middle East that are constantly shifting as well. So while we think of them geographically as one region, politically they can be very different. So that's one of the complications in trying to analyse what OPEC might do. But over the medium to longer term, OPEC could certainly replace the Russian production. However, in the short term, the chances of doing that are slimmer.
We know that rising energy costs play a huge role in raging inflations in the United States and across the world right now. We know that Fed Chairman Jerome Powell has announced a 25 basis point interest rate hike and signaled 6 more are to come. What does that tell you about the direction that the Fed's monetary policy is heading towards, and it is hawkish enough to rein in inflation fueled by rising energy and commodities prices, supply chain pressure, and heightened deflationary factors?
Yeah, well, I think this could have been part of Moscow's thinking around the timing of this move in Ukraine. The reality is this couldn't have come at a worse time for the global economy. Economically, there's a lot of fragility. Growth is slow and appears to be further slowing. Part of that is the choking off of demand from higher prices, but particularly supply side constraints are driving prices higher as well. Where we have demand driving prices higher, we've generally got a healthier economic situation. When it's supply side bottlenecks that are driving inflation, we've got an unhealthy situation. And that's the concern here. A lot of this relates to the disruption to global trade from the COVID responses over the last couple of years. For this to happen now is a very bad sign. One of the key reasons for that, of course, is that it ties the hands of central banks. They simply can't help. And so they have to turn to governments for fiscal and policy responses to the situation to help ease the problem. That increases the chances of local and global recession.
We'll be closely watching the situation. Michael McCarthy, Chief Strategy Officer at Tigers Brokers Australia, thank you very much for your analysis.
Thanks for having me on the show.
We'll return next Saturday on HKIBC. I'm Sarah Wong. See you then, and good night.